Great to be here with Leanne and Lonneke today to talk about open charging and talk about the blueprints that Open UK has been working on. So background to set some context, Open UK over the last few years has been producing blueprints around open technology. Last year we launched the Patchwork Kilt, the open data centre blueprint for renewable data centres. We're about to launch the open EV charging blueprint. We've worked with devolved governments, with the UK government, public and private sector to produce that. Leanne and Lonneke have been critical to that. So we're going to be talking today about the road to sustainability through EV charging, around policy, around what's going on in the battery sector, the open charge sector. So with that, I don't know if, Leanne, first of all, you want to set your thoughts on where you're seeing sustainability going and how open standards are contributing to that.
Yeah, sure. So I can bring to the conversation supply chain traceability and transparency when we think about the EV space. Largely the requirements there is around critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese. Without these critical minerals, there's no possible way that we can make the structures to support charging stations or even the battery that's inside of the car. It's clear that the light at the end of the tunnel is an oncoming train, rather it being the beautiful end state of sniffing nice roses and daisies. And what I mean by that is 2030 is a ticking time bomb, so that we have to realise those open and transparent supply chains. And arguably, I guess some of the challenges that we see in the space is recognising a really good data taxonomy, bring the right alignment in this lexicon of language across industry, where arguably a mining company has to somehow become sort of battery ready, as well as taking sort of the leap forward when it comes to understanding the Sustainable Development Goals or some of the United Nations, cry for action.
Okay. So that's great context setting. So we've talked a little bit there about batteries, about minerals, the limited resources we have. So I think that moves us nicely onto Lonneke. Lonneke, obviously, you've been heavily involved in establishing, setting up and deploying the work of the Open Charging Alliance. So do you want to set some context there around moving from batteries to charging and how you see that supporting open standards?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. So the Open Charging Alliance basically started in 2009 when EVs were actually almost non-existent. And the general opinion on electric vehicles was that it was a sympathetic idea, but it was not feasible, and it could never compete with the combustion engine cars that we all used to drive back then, and a lot of us are still driving now. In the first few years, it was mainly a tech development. Some people with a vision who said, well, this model of fossil fuel cars is not sustainable. We should look for greener alternatives. And that was also the time when the whole open source way of thinking entered the EV charging space. What you see now is that the transition to electric vehicle is also becoming a very strategic and a political aspect. So not only the European government or the UK government or the current American administration have committed to phasing out fossil fuels and transitioning quickly within the next decade to only sustainable transportation means. And a big part of that will be electrical. That, of course, given the current political climate, also means that if you want to achieve those goals, you have to have vehicles, you have to have the critical minerals, you have to have the infrastructure. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and it's very important to governments, to industries, and that also immediately makes it very political. And all the things that you might expect that could happen in such a new topic are happening. And we are really glad and optimistic that we've went the open source way from day one, and we're sort of grounded by that, and that's a stronghold. So no matter what happens, no matter if it's the oil industry or it's the Chinese industry or, utility industry or whatever who's trying to dominate it too much, we have this open source community and this open source mindset to make this development work well and work for everybody.
Okay, so you mentioned there it was very political. Are you seeing any particular regions or sectors more strongly drive the adoption of EV and open charging standards? or are you seeing any areas where there are issues?
Well, in general, the adoption of electric vehicles is going very fast in 4 basic regions. So first of all, it's China. China wants to develop a lot of technology. They want to move towards sustainability. And of course, they see this as an opportunity to gain terrain in the automotive sector. The incumbent or the old automotive sector is quite complicated. And an electric vehicle is basically very simple. It's a battery with software. So it's much easier to venture into electric vehicles than it is to other vehicles. So there are many motivations why China is moving very quickly, and they are very agile, and so they are doing really well. The second region is Norway. As you know, Norway is very rich because they have a lot of oil and gas and natural resources. So Norway as a country is very wealthy. And the good thing is, part of that wealth, they are investing into electric vehicles. So they are the number 1 country when it comes to how many electric vehicles are on the road. The third region is California. Also, California has a very progressive government, I think, relatively, and they have renewable goals. And of course, they are a tech-minded state. So California is sort of the 4th state, and the 3rd state, and the 4th state is the Netherlands, the country that I'm from. And sometimes people ask us, so why is the Netherlands moving so fast with EVs? I'm not quite sure. We're also, of course, a wealthy country and open to new things. So those are the 4 regions that venture into EVs. Those are the sort of the regions where adoption is going quickly, and of course where the industries reside that are affected by this transition are, of course, where car companies are mainly. And that is, of course, Japan has a large automotive industry, Europe, Germany, France, of course, and again the United States. So those are at the moment a lot of players that are active in the transition to EVs. However, at the Open Charge Alliance, we're open source, so everybody can download the information and use it. It's very good to see that. We also see a lot of interest from countries like the Philippines, Rwanda, and even though they may not be leading, of course, because they don't have the wealth to go first, they are helped by all the work that's being done in these more affluent parts of the world. Through the open source standards, they can just download and profit from everything that's being learned and developed there. So that's also why open source really helps not just as part of the planet, but everybody who's open to it.
I only wish the battery industry started in the same world of open charging and alliance. It certainly isn't the case. It's mostly dominated by incredibly deep proprietary. Whoever's got the deepest pockets, the loudest voice wins. So, the formation of these standards really started in around 2016 timeframe. I was a part of the World Economic Forum at that stage, and it was subsequently spun out as the Global Battery Alliance. But it's definitely largest voice, deepest pockets win in terms of the formation. And so we're starting to see, whilst there's some form of alignment of data taxonomies, but it's not necessarily reachable across the entire globe. And so now you're going to face this sort of unfairness and disconnected network. Certain brands will lead, Audi, Tesla, BMW, they're government funded with significant deep pockets. But arguably the new players in the space that are coming with new forms of battery technologies, not limited to lithium-ion, it could also be vanadium and redox. Hydrogen batteries are definitely coming straight towards us. Again, no one has really put their arms around it from an open perspective. And I think if I could turn back time, I probably would have been a lot louder and a lot more noisier and probably said open charge and storage alliance maybe probably would have been a good place to start.
So nice. So focusing in on there, you mentioned about open, you mentioned about standards. So thinking about regulation, I've heard things about the EV battery passport. Can you enlighten us a little bit about what's happening in that space?
Yeah, I mean, it was formalised as a part of the Global Battery Alliance just in Davos in the last month. So, all of the secrets and the cats are out of the kitchen, I guess you can say. Predominantly looks at the battery from underlying the EU directive. And the EU directive is very clear that says there's an extended producer responsibility when it comes to the battery. And if you are an OEM, a car manufacturer, Ford, Audi, whoever is manufacturing cars, they can't relinquish their responsibility for the battery beyond its end of life. So the EU battery directive is very clear in that you need to provide a transparency across the supply chain, from the source of critical minerals, looking at human rights, child labour, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And then the OEM is responsible for the battery at its end of life. So it's invoking this entire passport, not just looking at it from a source of origin, but also the circular economy begins to kick in. So whilst there's an EU directive, and it's very clear, and I think that's really the signalling globally to the large manufacturers, but it's also signalling deep-pocketed mining countries like Australia, where mines want to be battery passport ready. But, and you can speak a lot about this, the problem in terms of legislation is really where there is probably, in the European Union particularly, there's a bias against open source, right? So it flies in the face of transformation as far as I'm concerned. So whilst there's good-hearted willingness of countries and governments around the world to bring a better transparency to these opaque supply chains, it's held back in an openness state because of the EU.
Okay, I think that's a very good segue. So in the EV charging space, obviously we've got charge point operators, we've got the miners, we've got the manufacturers, we've got regulation. Lonneke, would you like to set the scene as to why you developed the Open Charge Point Protocol and then how you're working with standards and regulation to try and drive that forward?
Yeah, sure. So basically, when we, as I mentioned before, when we started in EV charging back in 2009, we wanted to work with the standard. And of course, when there's nothing, there is for sure no standard. So we just started writing something, and from day one, it was provided as open source. And it was very, very limited, very simple. Just start charging, stop charging. Basically, that was everything we had. And we started building those charging stations and those networks and just operating them, however small the industry was back then. And in a sort of agile way, as we learned and as the industry grew and more use cases became apparent and more companies joined, more countries joined, the protocol sort of in an agile way developed. The first protocol version was not perfect. We're now 6 versions later. It's still not perfect. It's still not complete. But the industry, of course, is still not perfect and complete. So it's sort of logical. What you see when it comes to the maturity of the market and also the strategic aspect of it for the European Union or for the American government or for Korea, governments now want to take more and more control, and they mean well. So I think that's the basic fact, that the governments, they really mean well. They want to put in place legislation, and then you see that governments from that point on take a different approach, where in the United States, for example, or Korean governments do not hesitate in requiring open source standard in their legislation. The European Union is very conservative and will not regulate open source standards. And their argument is that they have never done so and that they rely on standards organizations, ISO, IEC, institutions that have been around for a long time, have been done really well in the past, are 100 years old. For instance, the IEC, the first president of the IEC was Lord Kelvin. So you can imagine what a long time ago that was. But the thing is, those institutions do not necessarily develop standards in a way that is fitting with this rapidly evolving, agilely evolving industry. And this is something that is, I think, not a challenge for EV charging regulation, but in general, where if you are as a country or a region conservative in your approach, it doesn't match well with innovation, and particularly for the European Union, when regions like Korea and regions like the United States are embracing open source and moving faster and in a better way, in a more sustainable way. And then if you're sort of stuck with your old ways, then you're never going to be able to compete at a global level.
Okay, so in the charging space, it sounds like we have an open standard that's not yet ratified by a standards organisation. in the battery space, we have a ton of regulation and people focus on standards, but they're not necessarily open source or being shared. Why is that a problem, and why should standards be both open and open source?
Oh, I mean, we're all converted.
Yeah.
We're in the church of open source right now, are we
Just
not?
talking about,
yeah, I think history has really pointed to the reasons as to why this should be. I mean, I'm deeply concerned about just the proprietary nature and the imbalance, I guess, in the formation of batteries, when clearly the critical minerals space, as well as anything to do with renewable energy storage, whether it be in the car or even resident on the side of a building, doesn't form, a series of sort of open protocols. We might as well call it, the BMW battery passport. And I think we have an incumbent responsibility to ensure that we can innovate as fast as the supply and demand curves are being produced, rather than it being the deepest pockets win.
And I guess, like, for you, who do you think's missing from this picture? So we have the charge point operators, we have the battery manufacturers, we have vehicle organisations. Are there any other bodies or sectors that you think should be more involved in EV charging?
Yeah, definitely. So any electric vehicle needs to be connected to the electricity grid, because they have to charge or discharge towards an electrical grid. And of course, in Europe and everywhere across the world, there are utilities who are responsible for the electricity grid. In some regions, they are private monopolies. Sometimes they're regulated monopolies. Sometimes in Europe, you sort of have like the grid operators are regulated and monopolies, but the energy retailers are competing. But definitely the utility industry is crucial for the installation and the operation of the charging infrastructure. You need the power, or you need the grid to absorb the energy that may be fed back into the grid by the vehicles. The nature of the utility industry is that it's very fragmented. So there are, in Europe alone, there are thousands of utility companies. In the United States, I think a couple of hundred. And by nature, and you can't blame them, but they're a very conservative industry. They've been around also for a little over 100 years. They're responsible for a very important aspect of society. So they are a big stakeholder, and they are crucial to the transition for e-mobility. So they should also be included. There is a very good development from the Linux Foundation Energy, which is a new entity under the Linux Foundation that's working towards open source and energy. There are a lot of utilities, Dutch utilities, but also French utilities. I'm not sure if there are US-based utilities there, but they are also starting to embrace open source as a utilities, and I think that's something to be encouraged.
Okay.
For us, it's the open source community that's missing. The race is on for rare earths and critical minerals. So all of the stakeholders that are taking profits, that know that there's a race to get that consumer consciousness into the front end of the motor vehicle purchase. But what's missing is the cost of the planet, right? How do you get this aligned to a point where there's a consciousness about that supply chain, and open source is here so that we can elevate the standards and bring the community closer? That's what's missing.
So we have LF Energy, we have the Green Software Foundation, we've got the Open Charge Alliance. So in the open source sector, there's a strong focus on the technology around batteries and charging. Do you think consumers are aware of the problems that exist in this sector when they buy an EV vehicle?
I think consumers, from a human rights and child labour perspective, always just look towards cobalt in the Congo DRC, with these sort of atrocious photos that are shown. And that's not detracting away from the Congo. Part of our work in Everledger is traceability of diamonds. So when it comes to blood diamonds, there's no other company in the world that knows it better than us. So I do think there's an element of sort of ideation that consumers are having. It's not driven by millennials. But really, it's not the consumer that's driving this change. It's policy, it's geopolitical separation, and it's the supply and demand curve. We simply cannot drive the renewable energy transition without transformation of global supply chains. Australia is the largest producer of lithium in the world, and we have a lot of dirt in Australia. We produce 55% of all lithium quality in the world, and it's never going to go away from Australia. But the problem is, we can't get it out of the ground quick enough. And so we have to be able to bring a whole new sector of miners to the table, and for them to become shovel ready is at least another 10 years away. So I just know in my lifetime, I'll be looking at the transformation when I'm in a nursing home. I don't think I'm going to see it and grasp it in my role as the CEO of Everledger. I think it's going to be next generational lift that I'll get to see it, unfortunately, because we can't get the mines online quick enough. Now, what that's causing is really incredible opportunities economically for countries that have never necessarily been formalised in the mining sector before. And that's causing a whole bunch of other concerns around mine safety, and friendshoring, as they call it, right? When you talk about the defence relationship with the US government, they're coming on strong when it comes to manufacturing onshore. They're coming on strong with mining, but arguably they're not as good as Australia when it comes to mines. We know our mining, and so it's still a decade in the making.
And Lonneke, the same question for you. So that is, consumers, are they aware of the developments in this space and the impact that buying an EV might have?
I think it depends on where you are. In the Netherlands, if you're driving an EV, we've had, for instance, like roaming. So you have a EV services provider, and we've had roaming, so you can charge at any charging station since 2015, like you have with your mobile phone, with your bank card. We have a lot of charging stations in the Netherlands, so you can always charge. So Dutch people sort of wrongly assume that everything's already been sorted, and that the one thing that they're waiting for is the prices to go down, so the EVs become more affordable for them. But basically, the Dutch perspective is, okay, well, it's all like, so it's done. If you look at other regions, I listened to when we were introduced that a lot of places, it's for consumers, it's hard to find a charging station and a charging station that works. Currently, there's also a big discussion ongoing in the United States about uptime. Like, there are a lot of chargers out there, but they're down a lot of the time. So there's still a lot for EV drivers and consumers there's still a long road to go. I do think that it's going really fast. If you look at car manufacturers, they're really on board and they're developing a lot of models. Indeed, currently they are still using the lithium-ion based batteries. But of course, the internal combustion engine took 100 years to develop into the car that it's today. Also, the EVs that are on the road today or will be on the road in the next decade is not the final picture. So there will be ongoing development, and consumers will have, we think, a very different EV driving experience 15 years from now that they're having today. I do think, as opposed to you, I do think we will see this in our lifetime.
Very positive.
Yeah, so I think we're sort of hopefully similar age, or maybe I'm a bit older than you, but I think in the next 10 years you won't recognize. And the good thing is that if you look in the Netherlands, they're on the road everywhere. We see the first electric trucks coming to the roads. I think truck drivers are going to have a wonderful time because of the torque and just the way EVs drive. When you translate that to truck drivers, I think consumers will be, in that part of the EV consumers will be very, very happy with this new transition. So I think to summarize, I think it depends on where you are on the planet. Mm-hmm. If as a consumer you think you're being well served, or if there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, sparsely populated countries like Australia, we have density on our coastlines. We love living near the surf. But I could drive 500 kilometres to get to a petrol station. And therein lies some of the challenge, right? Some of the vastly populated centre, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, even Perth, potentially have some networks. But once you drive within 45 minutes outside of that densely populated city, you've literally got 250 kilometres to 500 kilometres between each petrol station. And therein lies some of the challenge that we have in Australia. And our population's small.
I like that you flagged population density and communities there. So shameless plug again for the Open UK blueprint, which will be launching on the GitHub following the end of this conference. The final segment that we haven't yet covered is community and the impact that EV charging can have on community. Bearing in mind, as you mentioned, Lonneke, the development of battery charging technology, and as you mentioned as well, alternative minerals and ways of charging. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on, should EV charging and charge points aim to improve the community in which they're sited, bearing in mind that some people might just want to zip down the motorway. What do you think?
Well, I think when there's a lack of charging infrastructure, and you can sort of see infrastructure, whether it's a road or it's a petrol station or it's a charging station, is like a facility in a country. It's something that citizens, like water supply, it's infrastructure. It's something that governments could choose to provide. In the United States, with the current administration, there is a lot of funding that's is going to be available for infrastructure. It's called the Biden-Harris administration infrastructure bill, and they are spending a lot of money on infrastructure. Part of that is for subsidies for interstate fast chargers. So exactly to tackle the issue that you mentioned, if you go further away, you have to have these like places where you can charge up. So the United States is putting up a lot of funding. The Korean government is putting up a lot of funding. So governments can choose to invest or subsidize or help or sponsor setting up infrastructure. I know that particularly in the United States, part of those funding are dedicated to what they call disadvantaged communities. So to make sure that more disadvantaged communities do not miss out on EV charging. In the Netherlands, we used to have this wrong notion that the first users of electric vehicles would be more wealthy citizens, like people with a lot of money or with a company car. So at first we thought we only needed charging stations in richer areas. But one great example, what we learned, was that in the area of the airport of the Netherlands, Schiphol, there are a lot of taxis. And all the taxis around Schiphol are electric. And those taxi drivers, at the end of the day, when they go home, they live in, not in big villa mansions, but they live in regular neighborhoods, and they want to charge their cars there. Or like people who do have these small logistic vehicles, they take the cars home with them in the evening, and they do need charging infrastructure. So it is really important, I think, for the transition as a whole, that you don't only focus on the more wealthy group, but also on, basically on everybody. Because in the end, within the next decade, everybody will need to have to make that transition to EVs.
I think it's a really good point. I don't think governments and planning organisations see it from the perspective of human first. I have this amazing story when I was the chief entrepreneur and I was driven with the Premier to look at all of innovation across the state of Queensland. And a part of our problem in terms of innovation is that regional Queensland literally has no connectivity when it comes to anything to do with data or wire. And as I began to sort of crawl through the back blocks of government, there was a significant amount of road infrastructure that had been built. And as I was sort of planning through a lot of these files, I found that a significant amount of fibre optics was actually installed across the road. So when we have incredible bitumen roads across all of Australia. There's some in the middle where it's just total dirt, but for the better part, you can actually drive on a very good sort of highway or an M1. And what I found was that the main roads department that came in built excessive amount of infrastructure for a single time use. And they built these fibre optic cables to enable the safety control of a large long haul truck where they could actually Wi-Fi in and or call out for the safety. But as the road was built, they'd literally just pick up, turn it off and walk away. It was insane to me that this entire infrastructure was already there. And so how do you literally go back and turn it back on from a community perspective that then gives that sort of secondary benefit? I think governments have a lot to awaken to when it comes to understanding how they can put this infrastructure at the centre of community, particularly for remote and regional locations. You can think about in Australia, particularly in those remote regional locations, the post office, the pub and the petrol station's one building. So when you're going there not just to fill up with fuel, you're doing life's business. And I can see that becoming a transformation event with, charge stations. And not only that, when you think about kind of these virtualised grids that are running in communities where they don't have access to 24/7 power, particularly in places like India, and there's brownouts, you can imagine that becomes a peer-to-peer type exchange of energy, and the world changes.
So we'll shortly
Not
open
in
up
our
for
lifetime.
questions. Before we open up for questions, if you just want to summarise your final thoughts and any key takeaways that you might have. Leanne, if you want to start.
Key takeaways. I just wish I could turn back time in 2009 and really have the foresight that you did when it comes to sort of batteries, and maybe shoehorn the open source enablement and the open source community into that space, rather than now trying to retrofit it. So for me, that's the biggest takeaway. I guess that's a life regret. And secondly, I think this transformation is coming so fast that it is a series of cooked spaghetti that we have to try and detangle in such a way. But definitely the light at the end of the tunnel, and I just don't see it being as easy as what people are pretending it to be. I think it's an oncoming train to us.
Okay, and Lonneke, what are your key thoughts?
So my key thoughts are that the huge benefit we have had and we are still having from open source. And I think that back then when we decided to go open source from day one, it was just because that was a good thing to do. And we sort of naively thought, well, everybody's doing it and we'll just do it as well. And it has given us a lot. It's given the industry a lot. So, the open source community is maybe difficult to pinpoint. So it's everybody that joins in. But, really big thank you to the fact that this movement exists and helps by leading by example and helps to inspire others to also go that way. I can't imagine this being successful in any other way than open source. I think it's impossible. It involves too many stakeholders. It's too scary for the companies with a lot of money, deep pockets. It's just too scary for them. It's not in their DNA. It's not in their interest. And I think having the open source community to push this forward is a great blessing. And so,
can you change the name of Open Charge Alliance to Open Charge and Battery Alliance?
Oh, yes, actually, if
as a yes,
definitely, sure.
Okay, so before we take a couple of questions, if I could just ask the audience to give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you very much. So questions. First question.
Thank you. Really interesting. If you could turn back time, what would open source and open standards look like in the battery space now? What would it be defining or doing?
I guess I can only retrofit it from where I know it's landed today, and the components that are related to the battery passport clearly look at the materialisation of the supply chain. It looks at human rights and child labour. And it also looks at the data exchange and the requirements of that from an interoperability perspective. So it's not one winner takes all. Coming from the blockchain environment where we are purely an open source enabled platform, it lives well with me. So I do think there is most definitely some secured private sharing enablements that battery chemistry is held to be proprietary to advantage the battery OEM or the car maker themselves. But I do think for the most part, 80% of the data that is enabled for sharing and the protocols associated with this should be enticed towards an open network, an open standard. And it's possible to do. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
So, Hi, Leanne. The question was actually follow-up to what you were saying about data. So, having open standards is one thing. Having open data and open source stacks is another. One of the things that I've seen in the market is if we're going to make this, one of the areas that I work in is in sustainability and ESG and getting up to get to net zero. One of the challenges is unless you have open standards, open data, and open source, you're really not going to get that ecosystem to adopt any of this stuff. It's just not going to happen. So I'd love to get your perspectives on how you think that could happen.
With a lot of work and a lot of chanting and a lot of leaning on what is proven to be successful previously. And I wasn't joking about actually leading off the shoulders of previous giants like Open Charge Alliance. I think there's a lot to be said and learnt and deployed back into this sector.
Yeah, I think to that is you only need a couple, right? So if you have these large corporations who don't want to open up or don't want to share or don't, pushing back, fine, let them. But as long as there are other companies or startups or other countries, as long as on planet Earth there is one small part where it does work, you can experiment and you can showcase, and then what you'll see is you'll do better. What we've seen with the Open Charge Alliance and our protocol OCPP, when we started, there was a lot of proprietary stuff out there. And then, of course, our reaction was fine, great. So, you do what you want to do in your proprietary way. Probably what you do is better than what we do, so fine, but we'll just do it the open way. But what you see in the end is that the collaboration and the openness, it takes you further, so it does work better. And I think you don't need everybody from day one. So if only in this space we can find a few who are willing to go the open way, and then I think we can definitely demonstrate that it's better.
That's one of the reasons why we're launching the EV charging blueprint. So that's how Lonneke and I met. So we are trying to encourage charge point operators, batteries, regulatory organisations to collaborate and then identify what an ideal EV charging blueprint would look like. So we can do that gap analysis and look for the gaps in open data and open hardware.
I think the key in attracting the giants, whether I can talk because one of our customers is Ford, is to clearly identify where the pre-competitive space lies so that there can be open and a collective set of efforts towards something that doesn't feel as though they're taking a competitive edge away from what is seen to be multi-trillion-dollar industry. And arguably, as I continuously are involved in the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, why are we making what is good for the planet and the next generation of the planet, why are we making that a competitive priced edge? It shouldn't be. It should just be pre-competitive space and we just lift all boats on it. And I think there's a large number of companies that can align to that value and value creation within a supply chain where that pre-competitive space isn't the edge of winning 1, 2 or 10 customers.
And with that, I think we've just about hit time. Lonneke and I will be talking about the blueprint in more detail this afternoon. So I'd like to thank our panellists one final time. Thank you very much for talking with us today. Cheers.